Welcome to our final session. My name is Leanne Carroll. I'll be speaking on Friday. I recently finished a postdoctoral position at the University of Toronto, and in August I'll be starting a postdoctoral teaching fellowship at Washington University in St. Louis. With this panel, our first speaker is Sarah ARCHINO. She is the Terra Foundation for American Art postdoctoral fellow at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris. She is also a research fellow with the Duchamp Research Center in Schwerin, Germany, and one of the founding editors of the And/Or project, which involves experiments on and offline dialogues between artists, writers, and art historians. Her title of her talk is Image Withheld, Censorship, and Avant-Garde Parody.
And always I start by lowering the mic. My thanks to Leanne for the introduction and to the organizers of today's event, which has really been a fascinating day of conversation. I'm so delighted to be here and to be a part of it. At the beginning of the 20th century, basic principles such as freedom of expression and an iconoclastic attitude towards the institutions of tradition united both political radicals and members of the artistic avant-garde. Particularly in America, where the language of anarcho-individualism, as opposed to more syndicalist forms of anarchism, supported the individualist language of modernist painting among both, say, the Hen Rice circle and the Alfred Stieglitz circle, there existed close ties between the avant-garde and politics, even among artists who were not explicitly political in their work. What some have termed philosophical anarchism or aesthetic anarchism united large portions of the avant-garde in New York, and yet this was an orientation that could bring unwanted scrutiny, particularly in the aftermath of President McKinley's assassination in 1901 by an anarchist sympathizer, after the Haymarket riots, after decades of labor strikes and syndicalist actions which were often violently suppressed. In the early years of the 20th century, anarchism was routinely portrayed by the political establishment and mainstream media as an anti-American threat to stability, a characterization which only furthered the alliances between the radicals and the avant-garde, who saw in this anarcho-individualism not the seeds of American ruin, but the foundational principles of self-determination and freedom present and intrinsic to the founding of the nation. One of the major connections between these realms, uniting socialists and anarchists alike, was the fight for free speech, which took on an explicitly political tone in, for example, the fight for birth control and the fight for the anti-conscription movement. But censorship represented a direct threat to the avant-garde. Sorry, that's my original. Now, the best known example of censorship in this period might well be Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, famously excluded from the 1917 Society of Independence exhibition by its board of directors, despite their no-jury claim. I'll return to this because eventually Fountain was circulated through the pages of The Blind Man, bringing the censored object into the world of little magazines and further layering in its engagement with the censors. But for now, I'd just like to say that the censorship embodied by someone like Anthony Comstock, the founder of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, lingered in the background of the avant-garde throughout the decade. Since most of the visible links between the avant-garde and anarchists emerged from the production and publication of little magazines, where artists, writers, and gallerists came together with more overtly political activists, that's where our attention will turn. In their campaign for free speech, artists explored the relationship between censors and press, and this paper examines two publications, the Ridgefield Gazette and the Little Review, which both used a tactic of withholding images as a means of resistance and critique. Refusing to provide an image to be suppressed, these little magazines found a way to subvert and to parody the work of the censor, which was embodied again in Anthony Comstock, a frequent target for anti-censorship campaigns as the founder of the Society for the Suppression of Vice in 1873. Comstock was admittedly an easy target in the teens, his relentless campaign against immorality drawing ire from all sectors of the avant-garde. Responsible for the federal Comstock law, which made the circulation of, quote, obscene, lewd, or lascivious material punishable by law, by 1913, he bragged he had destroyed 160 tons of obscene material over the course of his career. Satirical portraits of him often appeared in the anarchist and radical press, including multiple mentions in Emma Goldman's Mother Earth, the socialist magazine The Masses, and Hippolyte Hevel's 1914 Revolutionary Almanac, from which this lovely drawing is taken. The depictions usually employed grotesque caricature and hinted about Comstock's own secret depraved nature that was the compulsion behind his endless search for smut. While the threat of censorship was a general menace to radicals in New York, Comstock's suppression in 1915 of an exhibition of drawings by Clara Tice was particularly infamous. The show, which had been arranged in a popular Greenwich Village restaurant, Polly's Place, was the target of a March 13, 1915 raid by Comstock and his agents, who objected to Tice's humorous drawings of lithe nudes. In order to prevent the seizure of Tice's work, the entire collection was purchased by Alan Norton, the editor and poet associated with the little magazine Rogue. And the images were then published in the monthly Vanity Fair, where the spread actually appeared, beginning Tice's professional relationship with the magazine and its editor, Frank Cronenshield. Polly's Place was closely associated with anarchism, run by Polly Holliday and Hippolyte Hevel, and therefore it was a target of Comstock's attention. Tice's work itself was relatively innocuous. The show's location in an anarchist restaurant was what condemned it. In fact, the New York Times reported that the raid also resulted in the removal of an advertisement for a department store, which featured a woman in a nightgown, an image which had previously been displayed without any incident. But the censorship of Tice's drawings was a flashpoint for artists in New York, confirming their anti-authoritarian impulses and renewing their struggle against government control and Victorian mores. At the end of this month, March of 1915, Man Ray created the unique number of the Ridgefield Gazoo, a small handwritten publication of 4 pages, which I contend engaged with these fears of censorship in the immediate wake of the Comstock raid, by hyperbolically censoring its own content. The work drew on Man Ray's anarchist networks, naming several followers under punning pseudonyms. Only the name of Man Ray, as the sole editor of the Ridgefield Gazoo, appears without the protection of some clever alias. But then Man Ray itself was already an assumed name. The audience for this work is unknown. Dada scholar Francis Naumann believes that the work was never actually published or circulated, which corresponds nicely to Man Ray's assertion on this page that the magazine was, quote, published unnecessarily, while at the same time suggesting his awareness that subversive materials such as this could easily be erased from the public sphere. This adversarial statement was underscored by the slogan underneath the masthead, which reads, "We are not neutral," certainly political terms in 1915. Ironically, I should say the only known copy of the Ridgefield Gazoo was actually destroyed in recent years after an exhibition when it was mistaken for garbage. The cover is a sort of crude illustration of 2 grasshoppers mating, entitled The Cosmic Urge, precisely the sort of puerile illustration that would be calculated to draw the attention of the censors. And the connection to Comstock is made directly here in a poem credited to Adon Lacroix, Man Ray's companion, in a hymn entitled To Him. It's full of really, really terrible puns, please bear with me. Written without music, because of course music could be so salacious, the text chants, "Glory to Comstock, he destroyeth all evil, he destroyeth all art, hallelujah," before ending, ahem. This featured on the back page, alongside Art Mote by Kumroff, Manuel Kumroff, one of his colleagues from the Ferrer Center, which consisted merely of an ink blot. Maybe we can read this spot as covering an offensive illustration, or maybe it was meant to suggest that. Or perhaps in its refusal to follow conventional expectations, this was the sort of gesture that the censor would be expected to suppress. But how do you blot out a blot without merely magnifying the original? It becomes an image that's impossible to cover up. Throughout the issue, Man Ray similarly subverts censorship and control by simply not providing images to be banned. It's a sort of unpunishable provocation. The interior is divided into several sections, each one again an apologetically terrible pun on traditional forms of publishing and education. So just as the name Gezoek plays on gazette, here we have graftsmanship instead of craftsmanship, with a headline riffing on Gertrude Stein's self-published volume of 1914, proclaiming how to make tender buttons itch. Underneath the text by Macura, which is another pseudonym for one of his anarchist colleagues, we see here it's just censored with a large black bar, which we can read on one level aesthetically as a reference to the unreadability of Stein's writing to a contemporary audience, but also to its controversial reception among critics in America. There's also here certainly a sort of sexual innuendo implied as well. Similarly, blank is an essay in the social science section attributed to Hippoval. And the headline exclaims, "Je m'en fiche," roughly, I don't give a damn, with a blank rectangle underneath. So again, the anarchist response here is to withhold, to refuse to participate and to subject a work to censorship. A sort of self-censorship follows. We see here illiterature, featuring two poems, one by Adolf Lupo, otherwise known as Adolf Wolff, and the other attributed to A. Kremberg, Alfred Kremberg. Wolff's Three Bombs has received the greatest amount of scholarly attention, as it provides some direct reference to Man Ray's anarchism. At this moment, he's most closely associated with the Ferrer Center. And it's been shown that these three bombs were most likely a reference to those three Ferrer Center anarchists who were killed in the Lexington Avenue accident that Professor Cartwright just spoke about. Yet the tone of Man Ray's illustration was not heroic. The bombs here are being served on a platter with a fork and knife, perhaps a confirmation of Man Ray's nonviolent position, or a commentary on futility of such direct action. We don't know because the text below has been redacted beyond comprehension. But the use of pseudonyms, although here Man Ray uses them as an additional opportunity for painful jokes and puns, also points to very real dangers facing radical publications at this time. During the teens, a number of little magazines faced censorship, disrupting their circulation and complicating their means of distribution. This process is made transparent by Duchamp and his co-editors, Henri Pierre Rocher and Beatrice Wood, as they published their 2 issues of The Blind Man. So the episode of Duchamp's Fountain, which is such a centerpiece of Dada studies, has some way overshadowed its importance as an episode of censorship at its moment of rejection from the Independence show, which, by the way, was accompanied by Duchamp's apocryphal withdrawal of a painting. So in protest to the censorship of Armut's Fountain, Duchamp publicly announced in the New York Sun that he was withdrawing his own painting, Tulip's Hysteria Coordinating, an example of self-censorship for a painting that actually never existed as a means of protest, but that's another topic. Instead, I'd like to focus here on The Blind Man. Because before even publishing the censored fountain, The Blind Man already engaged with issues of censorship and seeing. Even its title, The Blind Man, can be read as a reference to the censor, to the hype surrounding the opening of the 1917 show. Published for the Society of Independence exhibition and timed to be published with its debut, the cover, which was drawn by Alfred Free, immediately questions the ability of the public, either the grand general public or an informed art public, to really see the art. The cover depicts some sort of typical urbanite, mustachioed with a hat and cane, is a blind man being led with a guide dog. The dog looks down, the man looks up. Neither one takes notice of the work on the wall. The iconoclastic nature of the magazine may have also been what prompted its 3 editors to take steps to protect their identities. So this first issue credited the work to a P.E.T., identifying the editors by initials taken from nicknames. And then the second issue includes the cryptic P.B.T. above the masthead, easily ignored and indecipherable to those who didn't already know the persons responsible for the issue. The result removes the editors from their publication, a separation which was increasingly important in the days following the official declaration of America's entry into World War I. And indeed, The Blind Man was published just as the Society of Independence show was opening, which was 4 days after American intervention. Even prior to the passage of the 1917 Espionage Act, a bill which allowed any expression of dissent or critique to be interpreted as anti-war agitation, openly subversive publications came under censorship. Beginning in June 1915-17, these transgressions were considered treasonous, a crime for which foreign citizens automatically faced deportation. To give you an idea, the 1917 Espionage Act took effect on June 16th, and on June 17th, Emma Goldman was arrested. It was a very clear message. But even in May of 1917, as the pressure was mounting, Rocher and Duchamp were sufficiently concerned in publishing the second issue of The Blind Man that it would be dangerous to them as alien residents, and they looked for alternative means of distribution. Their third partner, Beatrice Wood, agreed to publish and mail the work under her name, a plan which was aborted when her father found the copies. He forbade her to send them through the post office, and I suppose this was a moment when she still listened, and because sending them through the post office, they'd be subject to the scrutiny of the censors. And so according to Wood, it was Vanity Fair editor Frank Kronenshield, the man who had published Clara Tice's work, who recommended that The Blind Man be given out by hand. So its circulation, its distribution was very insular. It was given out to friends, to collectors, to gallerists as a way of avoiding influence from the Postmaster General. And it wasn't an unreasonable precaution. The socialist magazine The Masses had been banned from the newsstands on elevated trains beginning in January 1916. And then in August of 1917, an issue was ruled unmailable and treasonous, sparking a long and disastrous legal battle for the magazine, which ultimately led to its demise. The nature of the Little Review, as a radical journal made it an automatic target for Comstock. And the review of the Vice Squad censors, making blankness, making withholding images a relatively safe option for them to explore. In the June-July issue of 1915, we're looking at here a page from that number, Anderson acknowledged the adversarial relationship between her magazine and the official censors by celebrating the death of Anthony Comstock. In her essay, she hoped that his demise might lead to an era of relaxed scrutiny, a point which was sort of reiterated in pairing her essay, Comstock's Dismissal, with Our Credo, in which she announces the aim of the Little Review, which has now been in publication several years. She restates its mission. The Little Review is a magazine that believes in life for art's sake, in the individual rather than in incomplete people, a magazine written for intelligent people who can feel, whose philosophy is applied anarchism, whose policy is a will to splendor of life, and whose function is to express itself. So she takes this moment at the death of Comstock to reiterate the explicitly anarchistic nature of the publication, as if with Comstock dead, there were new possibilities for freedom. This, of course, would not pan out. But at first, she adopts here the blank page, or perhaps the nearly blank page, something captioned with some text, as a means of cultural critique. So in this very same issue, the Little Review used blank space to protest the sort of timid intellectual atmosphere in which it found itself as it struggled to find advertisers. This had been the first month the magazine had been unable to maintain its publishing schedule, and Anderson turned to the advertising pages, or I should say what should have been the advertising pages of the issue, to chastise the local business community. So here on the first page, we have a blank sheet with a text that offers a $5 bounty to anyone who helped the editors secure an advertising contract. And then she proceeds over the next pages to identifiably single out local businesses, a furniture company, a design company, Mitchell Kennerly Publishers, as organizations that should have been interested in reaching the readers of the little review, except that they were too afraid to become engaged. So she has several pages of non-advertising. Even more striking was the September 1916 issue, which Anderson later recalled included 64 blank pages. Now, this was an exaggeration, but the 13 consecutive blank pages at the beginning of the number was certainly a powerful statement. So we're looking at here the first and second page of this issue. It was a space, again, that designed itself as a sort of cultural protest, but also evidences at this moment the importance of art as a form of political action and withholding art as a form of political action. The blank space fulfills Anderson's pledge, a pledge she had made in the previous issue, that she would rather print blank pages than to continue to publish material that was, quote, good, but not art. So the first page of the next issue read, quote, "The Little Review hopes to become a magazine of art. The September issue is offered as a want ad." The next page continues. The other pages will be left blank. I have to say it's quite tempting to see a connection between this proposal and the blind man's claim that the next issue would appear when you have provided the material for it, a sort of contemporary boasting engagement with the reader. But the seriousness of this lack of art, and really this goes on for pages, underscores its importance, particularly when we see it then combined with the political aspect of the number. But it was underscored by humor. So the same way that Man Ray tempers his self-censorship with a sort of wink and a nod towards the viewer, Margaret Anderson followed her 13 pages of blankness with a pictorial spread depicting the light occupations of the editor while there is nothing to edit, which shows her going about the sort of luxuriousness of practicing the piano for 18 hours a day. She does include here suffering for humanity at Emma Goldman's lecture on the bottom left. Going swimming in her lawn sprinklers. I mean, it's a very sort of lighthearted way of tempering the overtly political message which is being sent, which was then underscored by the fact that the rest of the issue was perhaps the most anarchistic number of the Little Review, focusing on the Tom Mooney case and the preparedness bomb in San Francisco and featuring texts by Robert Minor and Anderson herself. So she uses blankness and humor as a way of diffusing what could have very easily been a censorable issue of the magazine. As America's intervention in World War I became more inevitable and political suppression of any foreign or subversive groups grew stronger, the Little Review also turned its attention directly towards the anti-war cause, but used the same tactic of blankness to create a political message which could not be censored. So in April 1917, Anderson published a blank page, "The War," clearly credited to herself. Subtitled at the bottom, "We will probably be suppressed for this." It was a bold and subtle statement. It gave the censor nothing concrete to object to, while making clear the very subversive position of the magazine. It was an effective means of commentary which allowed the Little Review, unlike so many of its contemporaries, to survive the turmoil of wartime conservatism. Indeed, the blank page proved more effective and more resistant than the pen. Thank you.
Our Our next presenter is SIOFRA McSherry. She is a doctoral scholar at the JFK Institute for North American Studies at the Free Universität Berlin. She also held a visiting fellowship at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and a junior fellowship at the Terra Summer Residency, Giverny, France. And she's also a co-founder of the And/Or project.
Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. It's been a wonderful day so far, and I'm really very happy to have the opportunity to be here and part of this really exceptional community of scholars. This paper explores an interdisciplinary and intermediate exchange between the artist Joseph Cornell and the poet Marianne Moore. These two key modernist figures engaged in an exchange of letters, ephemera, and artworks that defined their friendship and provided material for their respective works. The social theory of gift exchange, most famously outlined by Marcel Mauss in Essay sur le Don, and updated by thinkers such as Marilyn Strathern and Mi-Won Kwon, provides a means of comparing the visual with the textual in terms of their aesthetic, philosophical, and procedural concerns, and within the context of the work being produced by their peers in the avant-garde community. By representing the exchange of shared ideas and conceptions, as well as physical texts and artworks, as a gift system, the shifts and transformations achieved between their different media can be traced, with texts and artworks positioned in a non-hierarchical, cyclical, and continuous relation to one another. Both suburban New Yorkers deeply embroiled in the avant-garde, the social and professional worlds of Moore and Cornell overlapped thoroughly, and after their introduction in 1943 by the mutual friend, View editor Charles-Henri Ford, they engaged in an exchange of letters, ephemera, and artworks that defined their friendship and provided material for their respective works. While their friendship remained rather distant and formal, their correspondence was lengthy, and while I will avoid discussing biography too much in this paper, it's worth noting that they had much in common. Both lived in suburban New York at a time when Queens and Brooklyn were quite isolated suburbs. Both were single, celibate, and dedicated to their mothers and siblings. Deborah Solomon has described their interaction as awkward, and their friendship was carried out much more fulfillingly through letters than face-to-face. The action of gift exchange appears quite notably in both their respective practices. Cornell considered many of his works to be themselves gifts, created with a specific recipient in mind, a friend or ballerina that he admired, for example. His use of portable containers, boxes, and valises made a notable gesture to the gift in the form of the work itself. Moore, while rarely explicitly dedicating her poetry to others, received many gifts from friends and admirers, and while writing as a means of reciprocating those gifts, both in personal correspondence and in poems. Their work thus lends itself admirably to an exploration through the theory of gift. Moreover, I believe that the gift can provide a model for the exchange between the arts and modernism, as exemplified by their friendship and correspondence. It was a piece of art that inspired the friendship between Moore and Cornell, when she responded positively in a letter to his piece, The Crystal Cage, Portrait of Berenice. While the full work comprises a valise of documents assembled between 1943 and 1960, Moore came into contact with early selections from the work, which had been printed over several pages in the January 1943 issue of View. Her response in the magazine's editorial page inspired the artist to write to her. His opening letter featured a collage stuck down on both sides of the page, including an etching of a pangolin cut from a natural history textbook, a reference to her famous poem on the subject of the armored animal. Throughout the ensuing correspondence, the two New Yorkers sent one another gifts in direct reference to one another's creative output. Moore sent Cornell copies of her books of poems as they were published. He sent her, on one occasion, a dozen etchings of birds from a 17th century monograph on natural history, which is in the Mosenbach. This is not actually that piece. He literally sent her books and cutouts from books, but this is an example of how lively and beautiful these letters are. And all of the archival material I'm presenting to you is currently in the Rosenbach Moore Archive in Philadelphia. The gifts were intended to elicit a creative response, to add to the associative material the artist or poet might draw on while composing a new piece of work, and establish a sense of intimacy between them and a shared aesthetic world. The case study I'm going to look at is Muir's book Nevertheless, and Joseph Cornell's response to that in a letter. In 1944, Muir sent Cornell a copy of her book Nevertheless when it was published, and his letter of October 17 offers in return personal anecdotes and reflections on several of the poems in the book. In this case, his gesture of reciprocation is offered in words rather than in images and objects. The artist attempts to take the creative language of the poet in order to offer a tribute to her, rather than his own more comfortable visual language of collage. The letter opens with a long typed paragraph, quoting an anecdote about a Japanese dancer who is so finely aware of the balance of space and geometry that he could tell that a step was missing from the staircase in the temple gardens of Kyoto, because the composition, as it stood, did not fit harmoniously with the surrounding architecture and landscape. I would read it, it's very lovely, but it's quite long. Cornell compares the dancer's preternatural sense of harmony and balance with the exquisitely and rightly proportioned poems in the book. It is an anecdote designed to appeal to the poet who wrote Nevertheless, with its patterned syllabic verse, stanzas which form 11 balanced steps on the page. And excuse the bad reproduction, but I wanted to show you what it actually looks like in the book. The subject of the poem is the natural world, specifically the virtue of fortitude as represented by plants that have overcome obstacles in their surroundings, becoming misshapen in the process. Even so, its formal aspects mean the appearance of the poem on the page is more architectural than natural. Each stanza is precisely clipped to the same number of syllables per line, and the indentation creates a very deliberate stepped effect. Cornell's offering to her the story of the Kyoto dancer is likely a response to this disparity here between the unruly vegetation of the poem and the serenely formal layout of the poem itself. The juxtaposition suggests nothing so much as the kind of Zen garden Cornell's anecdote describes. It is offered to her in the spirit of a gift, responding to the form of the gift that preceded it, i.e. the poem that is at the same time a very formal garden containing overgrown symbolic plant life. The initial gift manifested in two ways, both the physical book, Nevertheless, which Muir posted to Cornell, and the perceived gift he received in reading it. Both aspects of the received gift are responded to in the letter, the actual physical material aspect and the disembodied part, the work of literature that has been consumed by the poet. Lewis Hyde, in his 1986 book, The Gift, How the Creative Spirit Transformed the World, read the literature on gift as providing parables of just so stories of the creative spirit, and described the work of art as an embodied gift. The gift is inseparable from the work itself and is intrinsic to the formal characteristics of the piece. In Hyde's book, the increase, the generative action that accompanies an exchange and defines the gift economy, is defined in three ways. As a natural fact, when gifts are actually alive; as a natural spiritual fact, when gifts are agents of a spirit that survives the consumption of its individual embodiments; and as a social fact, when a circulation of gifts creates community out of individual expressions of goodwill. Only the category natural fact, i.e. when the ethnography states that the gift is a cattle or a woman, implies the deeper truth that the return gift, the increase, the spiritual interest gathered on the exchange, will bear intimate relation to the form of the initial gift, as a woman's children will bear her genetic code and resemble her. Like children, gifts that are returned to the original giver will bear a formal or characteristic resemblance to the original object. In the example above, Cornell's anecdote is designed to respond specifically to the book of poems that Muir sent to him, the original gift he wishes to reciprocate. This desire is explicitly stated in the letter. Dear Miss Muir, after going through your recent sheaf of poems, deceptively slight, I wondered if they might not be as exquisitely and rightly proportioned as the garden steps in the above story. There is an extra level of suggestion in the anecdote that Cornell no doubt delighted in. In the story, the dancer is the only one of many hundreds of visitors to the temple who notices the discrepancy in the architecture. It is his special insight, drawn from his shared aesthetic understanding with the designer, which leads to the buried step being uncovered and the true value of the composition being revealed. If the steps are intended to stand for the poems and the architect for Muir, then the dancer, the only person fully capable of appreciating her work, is Cornell. He is thus particularly and personally indebted to her for the work, although it is in fact public and in the public domain. The artist implies here, and as at many points in their correspondence, that their aesthetic understanding of one another is unique, and in this way attempts to generate an intimate connection with the poet. It is through Cornell's appropriation of Moore's forms and themes that he demonstrates his understanding and appreciation of them, in other words, his gratitude. I wish to deviate from Hyde at one key point. He argues that there is a natural spiritual fact that allows the gift object to perform as a vessel, the agent of a spirit that provides the consumption of its individual embodiments, implying that these are actually consumed. Since they are actually consumed, their material natures have no further implication for the continuing conditions of the exchange. As in, the exchange will continue relevant no matter what the gifts that are being exchanged are in form. Such an analysis divorces the meaning of the gift from the actual object being given, a distinction both ontologically false and analytically unhelpful. The gift's non-material characteristics become difficult to define when separated from the realities of the exchange economy within which they are part. Increase, constant motion, perishability, temporality, the divine, and the creative spirit are all intangibles associated with the gift, which lose meaning when assessed separately from the particular objects being exchanged or the local social conditions in which the transaction is taking place. On the contrary, I argue that each gift object itself moderates the conditions of the exchange economy, in other words, the localized ritual language that the participants employ. Such a personal language is very much in evidence in Moore and Cornell's correspondence. In fact, both go out of their way to establish and employ personal associative references that demonstrate their familiarity with one another's oeuvre. The formal properties of the gift, the poem, nevertheless, is the original gift here, mediate the conditions of a spatial-temporal exchange environment, conditioned and defined by the formal properties of the gift objects that have generated it. Since the 1980s, the literature of the gift has supported the idea of such a localized environment, placing the individual gift object inside an active and responsive matrix that conditions both its form and the admissible or appropriate responses that may be made to it. In The Fame of Gowa, Nancy D. Munn describes the gift economy on Gowa, an island in Papua New Guinea, as a section of space-time, a nexus defined within particular ritual limits and subject to normalized causal and symbolic conditions. Apologize for the length of this quote, but I found it very useful. I have described this nexus roughly as involving logico-causal relations. The whole relational nexus can be seen as entailing ordering functions of causality, sequence, and likeness, as well as a dialectic of binary opposition, positive versus negative value, a template or a generative schema to carry the sense of a guiding generative formula that underlies and organizes significance in different overt symbolic formations and processes, and that is available as an implicit constructive form for the handling of experience. The need for such a conditioned environment to be established for exchange explains the formal consistency between a gift and its returns. In order to be active within the exchange economy, gift items entering it must conform to formal expectations in material terms that predefine it. It may be defined in aesthetic terms, as Alfred Gale's ethnographic theory of aesthetics, which he applied to non-Western traditions of decorative arts. In Art and Agency, he outlines a theory suggesting broadly that art objects act rather than communicate, that aesthetic objects are in fact technologies strategically designed to elicit particular responses. The anthropology of art is constructed as a theory of agency, or of the mediation of agency by indexes, understood simply as material entities which motivate inferences, responses, or interpretations. Gale, like Munn, builds upon Marilyn Strathern's deconstructed view of the gift economy made up of partible or distributed persons, and describes the resultant distribution of agency between subject and object. Actions and their effects are similarly not discrete expressions of individual will, but rather the outcomes of mediated practices in which agents and patients are implicated in complex ways. Here lies the root of the sense of indebtedness and obligation felt by writers and artists to one another, particularly in the attribution of gift-like characteristics to the work of art and its reception. Here lies the understanding that the work of art is not the discrete expression of individual will, but subject to the organizing and generative schema of the exchange economy of which it is part. Theme, form, subject, opportunity, and raw material, as well as reception, are parts distributed within the nexus of exchange, and the meaning of the work is derived not from the individual agency of its creator, but from an understanding of the symbolic formations and processes that govern the entire system. Gell's aesthetics emphasize the strategic construction of the work of art in terms of its agency in creating a desired outcome. Similarly, Munn's analysis suggests it is only possible to understand the meaning of the individual gift object through knowledge of the entire nexus and its processes. The creative procedures and practices of Moore and Cornell must be taken into consideration in the analysis. And I'm going to very broadly speaking, both Moore and Cornell adopted a similar approach to putting together ideas and materials to form a new piece of work. Both were acquisitive and associative, collecting material or phrases and juxtaposing them together according to a strange personal associative logic, and both were attracted to esoteric themes, exotic animals, European history, philosophy, textbooks, the arcana of vintage popular culture. Both use a collage technique, went through periods of aggressively avant-garde experimentation, somewhat at odds with their rather ethereal themes sometimes. They valued a mode they termed enchantment. The artists clung to those phrases in the poet's work that most clearly represented that mood. Tashjian, a Cornell scholar, points out that Cornell referred to and treasured a particular phrase that Moore used to describe his work, inspired bypaths of romance, something he rewrote in his diary as late as the 1960s. In 1946, Cornell wrote to Moore to express his gratitude for several phrases he had been thinking about. And so this particular bright first morning of November, I feel like writing and thanking you for the reminder that the mind is an enchanting thing and that it is a power of strong enchantment. To conclude, Moore and Cornell held similar positions, central to yet marginal within New York modernism, and their need to establish social bonds across large urban distances, both social and spatial, was urgent. The correspondence and exchange into which they put so much energy was a function of their need to create community and propagate intimacy with those who shared their aesthetic and ideological occupations. Gift theory is the characteristic anthropological means of explicating social connection, especially those that happen outside dominant capitalist norms. The gift provides a means of comparison between the arts and between artists that allows us to trace the origins of the artwork and the exchange nexus within which it is conceived and distributed with, as Moore put it, ever grateful wonder. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rachel Sanders. She completed her PhD at University College London in 2011, and she teaches at Oxford Brookes University and the City Literary Institute in London.
Thank you. Okay. A letter published in the correspondence column of the July 16, 1935 issue of New Masses attacked insufficient advancement for women in the Communist Party. Anne Weedon criticised the lack of actual deed and real results. That's a quote. She stated, "Abstract policy is beautiful enough, but pointing to token female involvement is inadequate." She argued that communism was grudging in its recognition of women, and that New Masses was exemplar of this, evidenced by its paucity of female contributors. Now, incongruously, the respondent rebuffed by pointing to female tokenism, Mother Bloor, and in a mocking tone adopted a reply, and in a mocking tone was adopted to reply, "Apparently Miss Weedon would like the CP to carry out the liberation of women before the working class destroys capitalism, but unfortunately this is impossible." New Masses was published out of New York between 1926 and 48. It was a periodical of arts and letters that strove to be America's foremost authority on communist culture. It was the offspring of the Liberator, inheriting many of its editors, contributors, cultural goals, as well as its politics. Now, Weedon's claim that no women were featured in New Masses is wildly inaccurate. Although significantly outnumbered by men, women were a constant presence, providing political commentary, cartoons, illustrations, poetry, short stories and criticism, reviews, and a variety of articles and journalistic reports. but this essay is focused on the visual culture within the magazine, on the role the organised left played within the productive life of female artists and critics, and their artistic and intellectual contribution to communism and its claims for gender equality. America's burgeoning Communist Party presented challenges for politically active class-conscious women. Whilst propounding a socially progressive agenda that included female emancipation, the CPUSA of the 1920s and 30s can fairly be described as sexist. Feminism was viewed as a bourgeois preoccupation, and its development among newly enfranchised leftist women was impeded by third-period sectarianism. The Communist Party did not conceive of any antagonism between working-class men and women. It accepted the behaviour and attitudes of the majority of ordinary wage-earning members, including the subordination of women. Entrenched sexism reinforced conventional marginalising options, not easily overcome by the tie of marital and maternal duties, that curtail participation, particularly problematic for involvement in a party where membership essentially meant adopting a lifestyle of meetings, recruitment tasks, and circulating propaganda. Nonetheless, the mid to late 30s saw a significant increase, somewhere between 15 and 25%, of the number of female members. Most joined through neighbourhood branches. The Depression unarguably politicised women generally. Housewife activism resulted in various forms of non-violent direct action, from staging food boycotts to hanging laundry over electricity cables. Linking consumption and production, home and work, brought female activists into direct conflict with male party leaders who failed to see this relationship. It was not until unemployment numbers were reaching 13 million that the party recognised that revolution entailed more than just seizing and collectivising means of production. Women played a prominent role in unemployment councils. This was a CP organised network that took a very pragmatic approach to suffering and grievances. And capable women were identified and sent for training in theory and policies, and all female party units were created in some cities to increase female participation. These consisted mainly of housewives, and they met during the day so not to interrupt family life. So clearly they failed to address the sexism in the party. Now, accounting for this sexism has been the focus of considerable recent historic debate, amongst literary historians more than art historians. Foley's argument that the root of the problem lay in the CPUSA's inheritance of the Second International's economist formulation of the women question, rather than a consequence of subservience to rigid Stalinism, allows that Marxism's theoretic constructs are conditioned by historical phenomena and political practices. And this view also accords with my assessment of the artistic practices, even amongst the most politically committed party members, that deviate significantly from Soviet ideals. The CPUSA gave serious attention to gender inequality and women's issues, evident in its activity, in its periodicals, such as New Masses, and most obviously in Working Woman, which was the party's publication for women. It espoused equality and encouraged debate, but it had no well-formulated line linking problems of oppression and exploitation. It failed to challenge traditional gender roles or recognise the egalitarianism demanded altering all social relations. Both the Liberator and New Masses exhibit sexist traits. The magazine addressed a male readership. The worker was generally assumed to be male, as was the artist. In arguably the most significant piece of cultural writing the Liberator published, Mike Gold argued, or proclaimed actually, that proletarian art would be an art that would sustain man and give him equanimity and not crucify his problems. 6 months into his 3-year stint as sole editor of New Masses, Gold then outlined his vision of a proletarian writer, a wild youth, son of workers, who works in labour camps and coal mines and steel mills, and harvest fields and mountain camps himself. He is sensitive and impartial. He writes in jets of exasperated feeling, has no time to polish his work. He is read but has few theories. Gold's concept of proletarian culture dominated New Masses during his editorship. He lauded single-minded, robust virility and its that was guilty of crudities, puerilities, and so-called crimes against good taste. That's to quote him. He lauded this above modernist art that was not associated with the feminine so much as feminized masculinity. Nonetheless, the characteristics regarded as feminine were negatively positioned to the masculine ideal of proletarianism. Gold's efforts earned him considerable criticism on the communist world stage, at the Kharkov Conference in 1930, and in international journals like the Literature of World Revolution and German Linksgeld, and also amongst American critics accusing him of leftism. Nonetheless, proletarianism remained a presence in new masses into the 30s, even after contact with Russia made support with its position untenable. Let's get some pictures up. It manifests as a cultural paean to that labour-hardened proletarian male, particularly in the work of Hugo Gellert. His indomitable, muscle-bound, ham-fisted workers regularly adorned the pages of new masses, as you see here. Male artists frequently denigrated women by pandering to the male gaze, through continued suggestion of female stupidity, through depicting stereotypes, and mainly just through the lack of positive imagery of any real depiction of women's experience. Sorry, can't work this pen. Okay. Rybak's drawing of a model and Matulka's The Bathers can be viewed as demonstrations of the artist's concern that the periodicals function not only as forms of political propaganda, but also as outlets of free artistic expression. However, that expression is clearly gendered. These depictions, the odalisque and the female nude in nature, are exemplar of deep-rooted traditional male-dominated practice. Additionally, the magazines host an abundance of big-bosomed bourgeois women satirizing their fatuity as well as their physiques. This is two good examples. Humour was frequently derived from ignorant, inane commentary of bourgeois women, although it is sometimes quite funny. This is a really good example. However, whilst the male of the dominant class exhibited a range of character flaws, greed, cruelty, indifference, the woman is always stupid. This was one of the most persistent means of utilising women in cartoons, particularly in the weekly new masses. Female stereotypes were heavily employed in both magazines. Now, an argument can be made, of course, for stereotyping being fundamental to humour, especially cartoons. However, the form of stereotyping wasn't limited to cartoons, and it wasn't so readily employed for males. Moreover, male stereotypes did not appear with chiefly negative associations. The nag, the gossip, the good time girl, prostitute. This is all fodder of these magazines, alongside less offensive stereotypes like victim and mother of sorrows. Plus, unlike men, women didn't have a ubiquitous heroic counterpart constantly pictured in the magazine. Just to give you a few examples of this type of thing, here we have a great working class shrew. The gossips could be any class or age. Sometimes they're pushcart ladies, and sometimes they're, in this case, gossiping young ladies. That dense, overly made up, short-skirted ladies loitering on the street was considered appropriate subject matter for the magazine. Never mind, the cover is remarkable. It lacks the veneer of pretense of judging the lewd behaviour that Withheld's burlesque offers, whilst, of course, at the same time allowing the readers to leer. Motherhood's a common depiction. She's generally victim of some misfortune and constantly has babe in arms, so amplifying her misery and suffering. These are good examples of that type of thing. There are image examples that shine positive light on female political activity. Illustrations of mass collective action, whether hunger strikes or marches, nearly always included women. Here we have Ned Hilton's handbills as a good example. Art also drew attention to significant females in the communist movement. Here we have a picture of the labour organiser Edith Berkman. Yet the body of evidence clearly points to a long-standing, viable, appreciative male audience. Equally, it underlines the fact that a large portion of the images featured in the political periodicals reinforced rather than challenged gender inequality, which begs the question how the female contributors negotiate these forums. Both magazines had female editors and contributing editors, and the business editors, the management and the advertising were almost exclusively women. Women maintained a constant presence through the contribution of a variety of material. Literary presence is more prominent than artistic presence. Both the Liberator and New Masses accepted submissions from unknown male and female artists, and this is an example of a female artist, Beulah Stevenson, her involvement very brief, just 2 images. But there are a number of these, particularly in New Masses, just one-off images by women. Like the male colleagues, female artists approached the magazine as outlets for free expression and published non-political graphics. The most frequent contributor of this stripe was Avant-Garde, who maintained a position on the periphery of the party, evident in her work, which tends to be personal in content. But her idiosyncratic style, undulating line and picture space graced both periodicals and was included 2 New Masses covers. Garg and Cornelia Barnes were contributing editors to the New Masses from 1926 to 30. Barnes was also contributing editor to the Liberator, along with Lydia Gibson, who was listed as an associate art editor. Barnes and Gibson were the most consistent featured female artists publishing in the Liberator. Barnes produced 49 works, including cover images, in a continuation of her involvement with Max Eastman's editorship, which had begun with the Liberator's predecessor, the Masses. Barnes' work had been integral to the aesthetic of the Masses, rooted in the broad, sketchy crayon, casual crayon line inspired by Daumier and Steinlen. The style of Barnes's art was comparable to male peers such as John Sloan, Boardman Robinson, Robert Minor. The content of her art, however, has undeniably a feminine charm frequently. Barnes was not above poking fun at her own gender, but some of her best works access the lived experience of contemporary women, as is evident in these 2 images, I think. In a similar vein, the work of Peggy Bacon, who, like Barnes, made occasional contribution to the New Masses. Bacon was an established artist who also exhibited her prints with the John Reed Club, an offshoot of the magazine intended as a forum to advance proletarian culture. Many female artists were involved with these journals, were also involved with the JRC. Garg, Gibson, Bryson, Berman exhibited regularly, along with artists like Alice Neal and Mina Citron. Female experience here at the heart of Bacon's New Masses images. And she wasn't the only artist of reputation to publish in its pages. Here we also have an image by Kathy Kollwitz, who published in both magazines as well. Gibson was a prominent figure in the Liberator. She produced poetry, book reviews, as well as artwork. She was the wife of Robert Minor, a key party mover and artist who edited the magazine from briefly in 1921, alongside Claude McKay. But Gibson's art is quite distinct from Minor's in style and subject. She preferred smooth, hard-edged blocks of flat colour, and the work is mainly non-political. She drew a number of these types of Polynesian nudes for the magazine, very sensual images that adopt the male gaze. But alongside this, she submitted images of women ploughing fields, and as you can see here, female embodiments of liberty. Gibson wasn't the only female whose work could be criticised for reinforcing inequalities. Both men and women were at fault for neglecting gender issues. Types were also employed by female artists. Bernard Bryson, a party member and a lead figure of the Artists' Union, wife of Ben Shahn, here with her relief investigator, references the Pieta, an emaciated, hollow-eyed child symbolising suffering and death of innocence. Elizabeth Old's Miss Manchester's musical programme for homeless men is actually quite unlike the work on which she'd established her artistic identity, this type of art. These 2 are from the Stockyard series, very matter-of-fact portrayals that were the result of her first-hand study of the killing floor of a local abattoir. 10 of Old's prints were reproduced in New Masses between 1936 and 37, mainly images of labourers. Miss Manchester is quite unusual. It relies on anatomical caricature in a manner similar to that employed by male artists. As you can see, she arches her back and she rests her heart between quite ample breasts. Olds draws attention to the ingratitude of the audience by way of their leering, but also questions the mindset, however well-intentioned, that led Miss Manchester to believe that an evening's musical entertainment was a productive way to help the needy. The implied stupidity, again, reinforced through physical stereotyping. Analysis of a sample of artworks of a number of regular contributors indicates that the intellectual landscape that these political women were negotiating was challenging. We have to look at the bigger theoretical picture to appreciate how they asserted themselves. None of these women commented on theory, but they would have been aware of the furious debates that were going on amongst leftists during the 20s and 30s over appropriate content and style for politically committed culture, because much of it was carried out in the pages of the Liberator and New Masses. Two women who did figure amongst their voices was Charmian von Wiegand and Elizabeth McCausland, both publishing in New Masses. Both contributed the significant portion of art criticism of the 30s New Masses. Wiegand first contributed in 1934, but her most active period is during the Popular Front period, 1936 to 37, and McCausland writes 22 reviews for New Masses between 37 and 39. Proletarianism, as we discussed with Gold, was proposed by Gold in 1921, and it gained momentum and masculine association during the course of the decade. Although it was rejected by the international left at the Kharkov conference in November 1930, it retained influence, as stated, in the US. Oh, excuse me, sorry. Arguably, Old's images of labour aesthetically conformed to the ideals of proletarianism. However, not being drawn from her own working life, they could be accused of tendentiousness. But the assuredness of her style, the lengths at which she went to study her subjects, capturing the unflinching comprehensiveness of the labour experience, lifts them beyond voyeuristic dissection of arduous and brutal toil. They are extraordinary in their subject matter, unprecedented for fine art, and McCausland identified this. Her priority tended towards content, and she applauded Olds resisting the limitations of traditional feminine themes and her repertorial approach. Concerns over tendentiousness were persistently articulated by key theorists on the left. This was the focus of Lukács's famous essay, Partisanship and Propaganda, which was published in Partisan Review in 1934. His ideas were consonant with those of Alexander Faddeev of the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers, or RAP, the organization that dominated the Kharkov conference. Faddeev espoused the necessity of mixing subjective sensual experience with objective fact and theory to avoid crude propaganda. This is the essence of von Wiegand's instruction to the American Artists Congress, published in New Masses in 1937, when she noted that although the artist may hold certain intellectual convictions, it is only when these convictions become part of his emotional life that he can integrate them with his art and life. Experience and agenda are embodied in Sarah Berman's Red Front, an image based on her participation in the December 1932 Hunger March on Washington, in which she was injured by the police. The aggressive staccato rhythm enhances the energy of the marchers as they move to face off the oncoming authorities. As with many works by female leftist artists, nothing in the image attests to her gender. The emotional experience that von Wiegand prioritized was ideally manifest as expressionist form. She advocated dramatic and violent expressionist forms as the style appropriate to the American experience of social struggle. Art had to demonstrate that it was felt to be authentic. Both Berman and Old's work may have achieved the elevated aesthetic standards that von Wiegand was hoping for. However, some of the other female artists are likely to have fallen short. For Faddeev, the subjective experience was required to illuminate historic development. He advocated the living person as fundamental to art and a means of avoiding stereotype and idealism. This idea developed into Topochnist within Zdanov's system of social realism, a concept for the type and the typical in character and situation. concern for the type and typical in character and situation. And images by Barnes and Bryson display this idea. Insightful depictions of female experience under capitalism. This, of course, would not make them immune from criticism. In 1932, the new masses was harshly criticised in international literature for advocating passiveness and non-resistance in artworks that failed to incite struggle. Nonetheless, communist cultural theory maintained the task of revolution did not fall to one individual or work of art. It was the accumulation of activity to which these women gainfully contributed. So to conclude, the party offered women theoretical focus, opportunities to exhibit and to voice in criticism. And it cannot be denied that these female artists and critics carved space for themselves within these magazines. Occasionally distinct female voices are communicated through the imagery, and there was never any intention, this was never intentionally curtailed. Class and gender concerns effectively come together. Most frequently, though, the women's art is indistinguishable from their male colleagues. Class outweighed gender concerns. The CP line championed gender equality, but in practice, all issues were superseded by the fight for revolution, unionisation, against unemployment, and by the end of the 30s, of course, against fascism. Thank you.
A little late, so questions for our presenters?
Thanks. Hi, I'm James Finch. This is a question for Rachel. Yeah, I was really interested by the images that you showed, and just really how diverse they were in terms of the media they used. And I mean, you mentioned Daumier, and it seems like they're drawing upon lots of different traditions. And I was particularly interested by one that you showed, which seemed to be a Gauguin pastiche called In Tahiti. Yeah. And I was wondering what you thought really was the audience for these kind of magazines, and how much, what sort of visual sophistication was being anticipated in them. For example, the thought that they would read this as a Gauguin pastiche, and how much difference that makes, and particularly because I mean, you showed images by artists such as Kollwitz and Tamayo.
Okay, so a couple of things actually I'd say from that. Firstly, on the issue of style, I've done quite a bit of work on this for both the New Masses and the Liberator, so I'm pointing in the direction of some stuff that I've written, because that's been my priority previously. I think people have tended to see them as quite monolithic in terms of style, and actually they're incredibly varied, both magazines. In terms of Gauguin specifically, interestingly, he was one of the names that came up after the Kharkov conference in a text that was... It's the key text in terms of American artists that allows me to look at the information that was delivered to American writers and see it to be also considered applicable to visual culture. And the artists that are cited as being worthy of attention are really interesting, because you get people that you would expect, like, you know, Daumier and Courbet, but then at the end you've got Van Gogh and Gauguin. Also, you know, these are considered the types of people to look to. Of course, that's 1930, and they're still looking sort of 35 years past. So anything that's, you know, nobody really contemporary is being cited. In terms of the audience, I mean, the intention of all these magazines, the Masses, the Liberator, the New Masses, is to find a working class audience. Clearly, as I stated in my argument, that the audience is assumed to be male. I mean, it's very rare to find anything where it seems sort of genderless in its address. It's nearly always, you know, leveled towards male, and the imagery, I think, really supports that point of view. In terms of the class base, it does seem as if, whilst the Masses was trying to reach a working class, it's actually quite a limited audience. However, there are records in early communist you know, party headquarters and places like that, in places like Seattle and such like, where it's clear that they are gaining a working class audience, and it's talking about them being passed around through doss houses and you know, I don't know, working, I think it was sort of steel mills and places like that, the shop floor. So there is clear evidence there that it has a working class audience. And then with the new masses, I think that's even clearer, that it does gain a working class audience. It's being circulated across the States. How large that is really difficult to know. The thing about these magazines, and especially when you get to the new masses, they're so cheap. I mean, you know, just cheap paper. And they were just passed around. They were intended to be passed around. They weren't intended to be purchased and kept, you know, as they were throwaway items. I mean, now when I'm researching stuff, they're literally falling apart in my hands. It's tragic. So I think multiple readings were highly likely. That was the intention, you know, especially obviously during the Depression era when it's just no money. I think by that time you are talking about a sizable working class audience, but male intended. I'm sure there were women that were reading it. I hope there were women that were reading it. I can't find any actual account, though, and I have looked. You know, any actual piece of written evidence that clearly shows that it had a female audience, unfortunately. Sorry, it's a lot of answers.
Appropriation of form and content in the exchange between Cornell and Moore. I was thinking a little bit about music, about jazz improvisation, about sort of riffing on something a musician has just done in the combo, in the group, and how the forms of writing letters or the forms of providing an object gift is a unique opportunity for a gift exchange. That there's something about the object quality of artworks and of letters that lend themselves to these discrete objects for exchange. I don't know if you have anything to say about the kind of materiality of these gifts.
Yeah, that's a very insightful point. I think the gift exchange framework has been used a lot to look at social practice art in the 90s. So very, you know, the period where conceptual art is very dematerialized. And that was really where it's the biggest body of literature in terms of gift exchange in contemporary art is. So I was actually interested in putting the object back into the gift exchange, to go back a little bit earlier in the anthropological literature, to when people are actually looking at the forms of the objects that are being exchanged and their ritual purpose as objects. So yes, in total agreement. I think jazz is a wonderful analogy because it's dematerialized, but it's not without form. It's all about form. Form is in fact what's being passed back and forth. That's the nature of the motif. So I think I hadn't thought about it before, but I think music is actually a really beautiful analogy for this. But certainly you've pinpointed that in my reading of the gift exchange, I'm very interested in the materiality of the objects, and that's one of the reasons that I used, and I wanted to show you the actual letters that I had in the archive and what they look like and what form the exchange is actually taking, because I think you're talking about artists and writers who are collagists, so the material itself is actually very important to them. Thanks.
May I ask a question? Actually, when we made a program and we chose how to arrange these sessions, as you can see, it's not entirely accidental. And I tried to apply some kind of key. Sometimes it was chronological in some sessions. It's a slightly different key. And I remember when I put this session together, I had a thought that I would like to ask a question, the same question for each of you. And the question is this: we are all scholars, academics, art historians, critics, literature people, some of you are Americans studying American art and American culture. Most of us are foreigners looking at American art, American culture. And when we study a phenomenon in American culture, in American art history, from the vantage of our own culture, our own country, our own countries, it always comes to my mind if certain phenomena that we study in America, in American culture, American art, if there are parallels, what parallels they are between a certain phenomenon in America and my own country, or France, or Germany, or any other European country. And I think that each of you actually could think from your own perspective if in the context in which you live or in which you study a certain phenomenon, if there are equivalents or parallels. And perhaps since Sarah has not spoken yet, could you address this issue, especially that you live in France?
Yes, so I am an American, but for the last 2 years I've been living and teaching and researching in France. And certainly that experience of stepping outside of the American framework into a more international framework has been really critical to my research, particularly in understanding the sort of received mythology of Americanness from within that context, and then to step outside that and to be working with graduate students in French universities and to see what inconsistencies, what gaps appear, what are misunderstandings of the same vocabulary, how that really deeply impacts understanding of, for example, a very central concept of my research, which is anarchism, or to think about modernism, or, I mean, this is language which we think is very transparent, and which in my last 2 years I've really had to unpack as being much more culturally specific. So I think it's been most helpful to my research to have that separation and to have a distinct framework. But perhaps it would be interesting to hear some non-Americans to speak about this phenomenon.
But you know, what I would like to know, for you, for example, yes, an American living in France,
yes,
do you ever take interest if there were similar or comparable phenomena happening in France, in French society, and what difference does that context make?
Well, certainly, I mean, something that's been interesting to me is the use of satire within the anarchist presses in France. And certainly there's a very rich tradition of these sort of satirical little magazines, especially in the turn of the last century, which is a great source of inspiration and something I'm researching for these American artists. And in fact, one example, which I didn't have time to speak about today, was printed in camera work and taken from a French anarchist publication. And so there are actually very concrete links between the sort of obliteration of images, which I spoke about today, and a parallel of sort of erasure, removal, which exists also in a French radical press.
Well, you know, today with the recent story with Charlie, the magazine, for most of us, it's the French who are on the front line as far as, you know, satire and, you know, taboo subjects are concerned, and suppression of freedom.
Right, and something that speaks very closely to a sort of French cultural identity in a way that is not, there isn't that same equivalent in an American cultural identity for this tradition.
You wanna?
Thanks. I guess the thing that sprung to my mind is obviously we had elections relatively recently in the UK. David Cameron, the Conservative, now is elected with a small majority. David Cameron at one point said that he really liked a group called Mumby and Sons, a pop group, folk, I guess I'd say. Mumby and Sons were disgusted to know that David Cameron had taken their name in vain, and they went around and told anyone who'd listen about that. In contrast, another group called Heim, which is like a girl group from the West Coast in the US, appeared on a breakfast TV show, and David Cameron was there, and they were shaking his hand, and he was kind of patting them on the shoulder in quite a paternalistic manner. And afterwards, when they were interviewed, they didn't really know who David Cameron was, but when it was explained to them, they said, oh, they didn't really know much about politics, but he seemed like a very nice guy. So, I mean, I guess there's analogies there in terms of, you know, artists either, you know, perhaps wanting to use politicians for some manners, but then, you know, you've also got those artists in a broad sense, you know, perhaps just want to disavow politics altogether and just get on with making their own art. So, you know, perhaps there's 3 groupings rather than 2, maybe. So, yes, that's my contribution on the David Cameron front. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I'm not familiar with any British magazines from from the time period, but I'm just assuming
there must have
there's sexism in there. That's all I can say. I'm just assuming there is. You know there is.
Goodness. I mean, very, very, very broadly, I suppose I could speak to a talk that was earlier. I mean, in terms of the gift exchange, I currently live in Germany, and I was, I thought what a wonderful example the Herr Ickstadt was talking about this morning with the Marsden Hartley coming to Germany at the time of the First World War, and his extraordinary response to the symbolism and the aesthetic world that he met in Berlin. It just occurred to me that was a very beautiful, or a very powerful manifestation of how exchange could work. But you know, the theories that I'm using are social theories. They have been applied. I mean, I'm taking theories from Papua New Guinea and Polynesia, and I'm applying them to 1940s modernism, and so I think that these social theories can work across the board. At least that's what I'm trying to do, make an ethnography of a small period in community and modernism. So,
you know, in this country, saying that you can have a social theory and that can be applied equally across societies. You know, our experience in this part of Europe, there was a theory that was supposed to be applicable to all societies.
No, I should clarify. I'm not talking about an ideology. I'm talking about a way of looking at the way that objects are interchanged between individuals within the context of particular societies. I would actually say that the tendency of this kind of work is to discriminate more finely, and to discriminate to the finest level within the context of what's happening between 2 individuals, what's happening between them and their surrounding society and community in context. So I would respond in that way. I mean, this is working, I hope, at least, quite contrary to the direction of generalization and ideology.
Yeah. No, it's always interesting for us. You know, when I listen to your talk, you know, and Sarah, the question of anarchism, for example, right? And you can quote anarchists, people who were anarchists, who wrote about it, who developed it as a theory. From Russia, you have, you know, Kropotkin and those guys, and then from several places in Europe and then America. And we assume that anarchism is just anarchism, right? If it's in Russia, in Germany of those days, or England, or the United States. Well, in certain ways it is, but in some, it's not just one thing, right? There are anarchisms, just as there are societies and cultures and nations, right? It's interesting, and I think that's the value of a situation like that we can explore and compare contexts, right?
Okay, if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking our panelists.